So I've heard that many organizations were wondering whether the destruction of property is violence. And I'm wondering what you think Gandhi's perspective would be on that.
Uh-huh. Well, the destruction of property is any day preferable to the destruction of people, but I don't think we could accept it as a nonviolent act. Even though you're not directly hurting a living creature, the problem, Amelia, is that in nonviolence, at least in principle of nonviolence, you always want to act by persuasion, right? You want to open the heart of your opponent, if necessary by suffering, and get them, by their own free will, to do the right thing. That's the ideal scenario. When you destroy somebody's property, you thwart them from doing something. Now, the thing that they were doing may in itself be wrong, but it doesn't make it right to frustrate another person and render him or her incapable of doing the wrong thing. You see? It's similar to the argument that Gandhi made that he can make a nonviolent actor out of a violent person, but not out of a coward. Because you have to be able to, you have to be capable of violence in order to renounce it. You know, I can't say, I'm not going to, I can't stand in front of a Sherman tank. I'm sure they don't use Sherman tanks anymore. But I can't stand in front of a tank and say, I will not hurt you, because I've got no way that I can hurt you. But if I had a rifle-propelled grenade, or whatever they call them, and I put it down and say, I will not use this, because, you know, that's not what I do, then it's an act of nonviolence. So similarly, if you just get somebody blocked that they can't do something, it doesn't really change things in a nonviolent way. That's a very clear principle, and I think Gandhi would be opposed to vandalism and property destruction under almost all circumstances. Now, having said that, there are always these gray areas, particularly emergencies. Say somebody's attacking a village, and they're bivouac there for the night. The first thing in the morning, they're going to get up, they're going to have a quick espresso, and run down and massacre everybody in this village. And you don't have the time to persuade them, and you destroy all their weapons. And then you stand there in the morning and they say, oh my God, what happened to our weapons? And you say, I destroyed them because I had to prevent you from doing this thing. Now do to me whatever you will. I would say in that circumstance that could be considered a nonviolent act, though not an ideal one. Ideally, if you have the time, you always want to engage the will of the opponent. To frustrate the will of the opponent is not nonviolent. Let's take this example. There are a lot of animal rights groups, or rights is another problem, but say animal cruelty groups, and no one could have been more against animal cruelty than Gandhi. He was, you know, for him, all life was conscious and sacred, and he devoted huge energy to the protection of cows from cruelty in India. For example, he stopped drinking cow's milk in protest because of the way cows were treated. That's why he only drank goat's milk. So, point is, he is totally against being cruel to animals. But would he be in favor of going into a laboratory at night and smashing equipment, opening cages and letting animals out? Not sure that he would be. I think probably not, and for the reasons that we've been mentioning. You want to awaken the sensitivity of the scientist who's performing the experiment so that he or she, himself or herself, will say, oh my God, I can't do this to these creatures, and let them go. Okay? That's the principle. But now that we've said all that, there are emergencies, and there might be times when people think, there isn't enough time to awaken the hearts of the opponent, I've got to intervene now. Still, I don't think that property destruction is something that anybody should go to until everything else has been exhausted, even for an extreme emergency.
And I know that Gandhi at times has burnt cloth. And what do you think about that, violence against the cloth?
Yeah, that's a good question, Amelia. Well, I wouldn't call it violence against the cloth, because the cloth, unless you hold certain theories, is unconscious, right? It's an inanimate object, but it's violence against the owner of the cloth. But that's the trick. In this particular case, the owner of the cloth was the one burning it. So he didn't advocate you know, intercepting a shipload of British cloth and dumping it overboard. But he said, take the cloth that you've purchased and destroy it. That's totally different, because that's not destroying someone else's property against their will. That's the point, is the will. It's not against the will of the owner. You are the owner. So this becomes not only not an act of violence, it's an act of sacrifice, which is the highest kind of nonviolence. So it shows you how you've got to be really careful taking an example that superficially resembles something, but if you look in terms of the human spirit behind it, it's totally different.
What was the point of burning the cloth?
The reason that the cloth was actually burned instead of just being put aside has to do with the symbolism of burning as a sacrificial act in India. Once something is burned, it cannot be recovered. Once in the act of burning, it's actually being given to the gods. You no longer have access to it. So if you say, I'm not going to wear this, and you put it in the closet, but then the viceroy comes and you're tempted, you take it out of the closet. But once it's burned, you can't do that. It's complete renunciation. And Indians had been very, very imbued with that symbol, the fire, the sacrificial fire, for thousands of years. So it had a very powerful effect on them. When you take sannyas, you know, when you go to a state of renunciation, when you give up the world, you take your sacred cloth, throw it in the fire. Maybe you take your shirt, throw it in the fire. Yeah.
And what about the scenario of Atpur?
Atpur, oh yeah, you're remembering that film, Bringing Down the Dictator. The protesters are approaching Belgrade. The police have blocked the road with a truck, and the police have made it clear they're not going to defend the truck, they're just going to set it up and step aside. And so the protesters who are on their way into the city, they push the truck off the road. There are a lot of borderlines and gray areas in the real world, and I didn't feel that was terribly violent, because whose truck was it? It's not like the poor owner is standing there saying, you know, this truck is my livelihood, you know, please don't injure it. It's the government's truck, probably, and the people paid for it with their tax money. And then again, you could also say that this was an emergency. They've been planning this for a year. They had one day to when it was going to happen, so they had to get to Belgrade. I don't like using that kind of reasoning, because people could always say, oh, I had to, I had no choice, and you could justify anything that way. So let's not push that argument too hard, but it wasn't an attempt to injure or even really to persuade the owner of the property. It was just some property that had been put in their way, they pushed it out of their way. But I do remember a terrible case when people were protesting at a nuclear plant back in New England. And there was a big fence. To get over the fence, they threw like an anchor over that fence. Unfortunately, on the other side of the fence, it landed on somebody, landed on a policeman. So, you know, again, they didn't intend to hurt the policeman. That's very important. But they risked it. That's a very real thing. And you'd have to say that it was not ideal. But then, in real life, you don't get a lot of chances to do the ideal thing. You know, another case might be the raid on the salt pans, which is the climax of the freedom struggle. Again, you could say that's somebody else's salt. But that's the whole point of the campaign, is it's not somebody else's salt. This is God's salt. He put it in the Indian Ocean. It belongs to any Indian who can get it out of there. So it's being intercepted and monopolized by the British. So this is really, and I really believe that this argument is valid, this was a repossession, not a stealing of the cloth. So that's the general principles anyway.